Well, good afternoon to everybody, and I want to welcome you to a particularly unique press conference and event. I would argue also the most important one at our COP25, and that's because of the hundreds of presentations, PowerPoints, lectures, and talks. This is the only one which addresses really the core problem at the heart of almost all the planet's environmental challenges, and that would be overpopulation. Unfortunately, this is an issue which has not been a part of the discourse at all, much less a central part, which is why my colleagues and I chose to entitle today's session, A Seat at the Table. Now, I'd like to get us started by a map which shows what we've been through as a humanity. Let's recall that it was about 200,000 years ago that Homo sapiens began to wander the earth, and it took 200,000 years until we reached the number of 1 billion people. Demographers think that took place in 1802. Another century brought us a second billion people. And then we have, about every 15 years, 1 billion people, up till the 7.7 billion people who fill the earth today. And as we watch the earth fill up, you can well imagine that every single dot there and the millions of people that they represent affected the environment. The United Nations tells us that population growth on the planet has slowed down somewhat. And therefore, it now takes about 25 years to add another billion people. So we're looking at a population on the planet of 11 billion people by the end of the century. And we're here to tell you that this has to be a central issue when we consider global climate strategies. Now, we have been told by our fates that we need to be fruitful, fill the earth, but the earth is full, and now it's time to think about sustainability. Let's take a look at the correlation between CO2 emissions and world population. Not surprisingly, it looks pretty close. We can take a country like South Africa. In the last 27 years since the UNFCCC was approved, we've seen a 50% increase in emissions in South Africa and a 47% increase in its population. Basically, what we have here is a representation of the fact that every day, 383,000 children are born, each one of them with an absolute right for equal opportunity, which means an equal carbon footprint. And if you look at the trends, there's starting to be a convergence of the carbon footprints around the world. So if we're talking about adding another 3 billion people, we're talking about an impossible situation. Now, another master student, Seth Wine from the University of British Columbia, asked a simple question that was recently published in Environmental Letters. He said, what can every one of us do to reduce our carbon footprint? And there are a lot of things we could do. You can recycle. You can move to a plant-based diet is a wonderful thing to do. Buy green energy if you can move to renewables. Avoid one long trans-Pacific or Atlantic flight. That's maybe something we all need to think about here at the COP. Forget your car and move to more sustainable forms of transportation. That's one. But mostly what we hear about is recycling. But what he reached, the conclusion was the single most important thing, almost 60 times more than any other thing, have one less child.
Holy cow. May I interrupt you?
Sure.
That's a really surprising result. I wish I had known that before I decided to get 3 children. How come I didn't know?
I wish I had known it before I had 3 kids too. But the truth of the matter is, it's not really cited in the textbooks. This is one issue we don't really talk about. Now, why don't we talk about overpopulation in our environmental movements around the world? Well, for a long time now, in the climate discourse, advocates have had a great aversion to claims that overpopulation was driving the problem. For them, the problem was one of consumption, sort of the avaricious lifestyles and consumer societies of the West. That, they claim, is what's driving. And that position made a lot of sense, perhaps, back in 1992 when the convention was first adopted. At that point, the average annual carbon equivalent emissions of developing countries was about 0.5 tons, as opposed to 2.8 tons in the wealthier countries. But since that time, a lot has changed. So for a country like China, we've seen a 350% increase in its total emissions. This is good news. This means that less people are hungry. We want this kind of prosperity, but there are consequences as well. And so what we see around the world now is that although in the original days of the climate convention, developing countries dominated the emissions portfolio of the planet. Today, it's the other way around. Those countries that were defined as developing countries, they're the ones. India isn't quite as extreme as China, but the trends are clear there as well. And that seems to be the story everywhere. We see in countries like England, France, Scandinavian countries, a drop as much as 30 or 40% in carbon footprints. In other countries, as they adopt low-carbon technologies, are going that way. And yet, in the developing world, it's coming up. So we have to start thinking about this. Now, when I think about this issue of consumption versus population, I like to go back to the metaphor that Paul Ehrlich proposed. And he said, look, this whole environmental impact, this carbon footprint is a rectangle. And today it may not be entirely sure whether the long side of the rectangle is consumption or maybe it's population. But the size of the rectangle stays the same. And my point is, unfortunately, the entire rectangle is growing because developing countries are growing rapidly in some cases, and the carbon footprint is growing as well. My own country of Israel is a case in point, and you'll have to look at this graph from right to left because we're a country that reads right to left. But basically, our overall emissions have increased over the last period of time. It's almost doubled since those days of Rio de Janeiro and the conference. And that's because our population has been growing at about 1 million people a year. So even though, if you take a look at this graph, you can see a drop in per capita emissions, we can see that the overall emissions are increasing. Basically, the metaphor I like to use is we're running on a treadmill. As fast as we try to move forward, as much as we try to reduce our carbon footprint, if the world's population continues to grow the way it will, we're not going to make any progress. Size matters. And so what we hope in this session is to call on the senior players, people like the IPCC who wonderfully put in a chapter about consumption in the upcoming report, but left population off the agenda. We think we need a seat at the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Alon.